Hello everyone, how have you been? I hope I find you all in good health. I'm Ergi, and today here I am to answer a question posed by one of my patrons again. This question was specifically if there is any perception of the spirit spouse concept within shamanism but in pre-Christian Old Norse belief system. Or in other words, if there is the spirit spouse idea in Norse shamanism. Of course, I have given my answer to the patron in question a long time ago, and well, I shared it among all of my other patrons as I usually do. But now I decided to share it with all of you as well and develop this even more. So before I actually share with you the answer I have given to my patron, I have decided to also speak about gender and sexual identity in shamanism and develop a little bit more on the spirit spouse conception, and then transport all of this into Old Norse belief system, if it is even possible, of course. So this video will surely be longer than I expected, so I'll try to be quick about it. There's a lot to say, actually, but I'll try to summarize it a lot, but still try to retain the main ideas and important concepts so you can have some foundations and explore for yourself afterwards if you have further interest in this subject, of course. I also know that some of you already know a lot about this subject, even more than I do, which isn't that difficult, but others are also eager to learn, and we are all eager to exchange knowledge and share knowledge with one another. And there's always something new to learn. So, with no more delay, please, let's get started. I've recently been asked if the concept of spirit spouse can be found in Nordic shamanism. So first things first, what exactly is a spirit spouse? So a spirit spouse or spirit wife or husband is a concept directly associated with shamanism. This particular spiritual entity enters in the category of spirit guides and or spirit guardians. And to be more specific, they enter in the main category of what we call tutelary spirits. Mind that these categories are purely for an academic point of view to better understand such spiritual conceptions and try to pass on this knowledge within shamanism. I have a video precisely about helping spirits in shamanism, which I urge you to watch that video if you can, of course, so you can have even more basic notions to help you understanding all of this that is being said and what shall be said throughout this video. Now, the spirit spouse is a very widespread phenomenon in almost every culture that retains shamanic expressions of faith and holds animistic worldviews both in their religious and social daily lives. The spirit spouse is perceived as being one of the most important spiritual entities from whom the shaman receives knowledge from, and guidance and even power, spiritual power in the spiritual world and from the spiritual world. We can almost perceive it as a spiritual entity bound to the shaman, whose main objective is indeed to aid the shaman in the spiritual world, in the realm to which this entity is very familiar with. It is its own reality, therefore it possesses knowledge the shaman doesn't have, and as such, guides and protects the shaman. So it is a helping spiritual entity, which becomes a tutelary spirit specifically of the shaman. In other words, the spiritual entity closer to the shaman, with which the shaman works with more often and the shaman depends on. Because their relationship is the strongest relationship the shaman has with any spiritual entity, the spirit and the shaman form a spiritual alliance, and the spiritual entity becomes the spirit spouse of the shaman, of the particular shaman, attached to this spirit, bound by the great dependence the shaman has on this spirit, which is the main spirit that gives power to the shaman and helps him or her not only in the preparations to achieve ecstasy, but also helps in the spiritual journey itself. The term spirit spouse or spirit husband or wife reflects an intimate relationship that is created between the shaman and his or her spirit guide. And when I say spirit husband or spirit wife, it's actually a lot more common to find spirit wives, but a spirit husband isn't unheard of. But we shall get to it further ahead. In shamanism, it is believed that this spiritual entity can shapeshift, like old spirits, and assume a form suitable to aid the shaman. This shapeshifting quality is mainly focused on gender transformation to provide a pairing relationship, and this enters in the panorama of gender and sexuality within shamanism, which we shall explore further ahead as well. Don't worry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, we can say that we have mainly two perceptions on the acquisition of a spirit spouse. Now, first, in some cultures, having a spirit spouse is necessary. It is one of the very first things to obtain, or at least it is an expected part of the initiation of a person in the rituals to become a shaman. After a series of ritual ceremonies, preparations of the person to finally become a shaman, if the person actually survives and succeeds and becomes a shaman, the first thing the person will do is to seek out a spirit spouse. Because the shaman needs a tutelary spirit to guide the shaman in the spiritual world. So the shaman's first activity, the shaman, and not the person being initiated, but the shaman, after surviving and successfully becomes officially a shaman, the person will seek out a tutelary spirit with which an everlasting relationship can be created, and the spirit of the shaman becomes attached to this spiritual entity, and vice versa, obviously, until the shaman's death. And in many cultural backgrounds, even after death. Although, secondly, in many other cultures, this spiritual entity isn't required to be obtained in the initiation process, and so the shaman will find it, or it will find the shaman, during a variety of dreams, trance, and other ritual elements along the shaman's performances and throughout the shaman's life. And here we find our first problem, because this last point, the fact that a spirit spouse isn't required at all in a lot of cultures whose spiritual and religious beliefs are animistic in nature, this means that in many cultures, this shamanic conception of a guiding spirit, specifically as a spirit spouse, either doesn't exist at all, or with the transformations of the religious panorama, influences from other religions and cultural syncretism, the spiritual entity can only be found either in folklore or became a shadowy and mysterious figure in literature reporting to a pagan past. And as such, this entity is transformed into something more poetic, or simply transformed to fit into literature. And this seems to be the case in pre-Christian Scandinavia. Indeed, in Old Norse literature, written sources, we find something similar to the concept of spirit spouse, but not as it is believed to be within the Western anthropological studies of shamanism, but something else entirely to specifically fit into Old Norse literature and poetic subjects that reflects certain ideas retained in folklore. But we shall get to that further ahead. Now, we have a second problem, the spirit husband and the spirit wife. So let's explore that for a moment. So we have the particular problem with the gender of the spirit spouse, because we find a lot more spirit wives than spirit husbands in the great majority of cultures whose religions are based on animistic worldviews. The conceptions of a spirit husband might not actually have been an original perception of animistic societies, as we find a lot more female tutelary spirits rather than male. In fact, the idea of spirit husband and wife doesn't add up to the animistic worldview within shamanic cultures, because what we seem to have in shamanism, universally speaking, is the simple existence of tutelary spirits as helping spirits, but with a more profound relationship with the shaman, rather than an actual marriage. What I'm saying here is that we often deal with tutelary spirits in shamanism, and of the shaman as spirits of various forms, which the shaman doesn't necessarily has to create some sort of alliance through a spiritual marriage. Therefore, the concept of husband and wife for these tutelary spirits did not exist originally. Spiritual entities that are attached to the shaman as guides, guardians, or familiar spirits are usually of ancestral shamans or female spirits or spiritual entities with whom the shaman built a closer relationship with through various shamanic workings. And the spirit remains there, attached to the shaman, to help out the shaman, and these are usually animal spirits, either with a familiar animal form or animal hybrids as the form the spiritual entity adopted to present itself to the shaman. There wasn't necessarily this idea of a spirit husband and or a spirit wife, a male spirit for female shamans and a feminine spirit for male shamans. No actual conception of spirit husband and or spirit wife before colonialism. And I'm saying this because in the very few shamanic cultures where there is the belief in a spirit spouse as actually being spirit husband and or spirit wife, seems to have been a post-colonial idea adopted by such communities when in contact with religious ideas such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Because the idea of the spirit spouse is actually quite simple. Each shaman woman has a spirit husband and each shaman man has a spirit wife. So quite shallow, this perception. It's specifically gender opposites, and this makes all the difference. Within cultures that retain animistic worldviews, and therefore their shamanic conceptions follow such animistic worldviews, gender fluidity is something a lot more noticeable. Shaman women can have as much contact with female spirits as they can with male spirits. And shaman men, likewise, can have as much contact with feminine spiritual entities as well as male. There wasn't this specific gender restriction imposed to the shaman as having to specifically have a spirit spouse of the opposite gender. This seems to be a conception greatly reinforced after colonialism, but it already existed at least during the Middle Ages. We rarely find any spirit husband simply because there were no gender restrictions, because the shaman itself already represents the fluidity of gender and sexuality, as it is a person that works with both female and male spiritual entities and needs such fluidity, even sexually speaking, to be able to have a better relationship with the spiritual entities and the supernatural in general. It is actually in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that there was, to a certain extent, there still is, this specific imposition of the male building a relationship with a female and not with the same gender. This is actually very similar to the conception of incubus and succubus within Christian literature, as male and female spirits, demons, respectively, having sexual intercourse with human beings and becoming the sort of lovers of their humans of the opposite sex. This conception was introduced in the Middle Ages as a form of Christian religious explanation for the spiritual entities of the pagans with whom people had a more intimate relationship. And this idea of female demons having sexual intercourse with male humans and male demons with female humans was greatly developed after colonialism and introduced into a variety of people, especially in African cultures, because it's actually in African cultures that we find a lot more evidences for spirit husbands. And out of Africa, in far more remote areas where colonialism was indeed felt but wasn't as intense as it was in Africa, the spirit husband simply doesn't exist. nor does the spirit wife for that matter. The only thing we have are female tutelary spirits. But that doesn't mean that just because they help the shaman, they are intimately or immediately the shaman's wives. We have no time to explore the incubus and succubus conceptions, but let me just tell you that even though they are seen as demonic entities in Christian literature, that doesn't mean they are evil in nature. Not among every Christian religious manifestation, anyway. In fact, Roman Catholicism sees incubus and succubus as being the same spiritual substance as angels are. But the only difference is that they have fallen into the pleasures of the flesh, and as such entities have sexual intercourse with humans. And if you want to know, that is called demoniality, having sexual intercourse with demons. The point here is that the incubus and the succubus, incubi, succubi, desire only to state their appetite for sexual release, and generally there is no attempt, or indeed the primary objective isn't to harm anyone, it's just for sexual release. And this is pretty interesting because it follows the same line of thought of the animal hybrids and the mythical creatures of folklore and of pre-Christian pagan mentality. And the incubi and succubi are purely spirits, none other than the fauns, sylvians, elves, trolls, goblins, and satyrs, and such other creatures of pagan belief. And by the conception of the incubi and succubi, there is actually a reconnection and a new link between the old and the new religious manifestations, between what was understood to be pagan and with Catholicism, mainly. All these spirits that had intimate relationship with human beings report back to shamanic beliefs, and precisely the shaman having a more intimate relationship with the spirits. Now, this relationship was later on understood to be a marriage between the shaman and the spirits in question, but understood like this by the Western society, and an idea greatly fermented during colonialism and post-colonialism. And as such, the male shaman needed a female spirit, and the female shaman needed a male spirit, which, as I've said, such a conception isn't or doesn't seem to be originally an animistic belief, since helping spirits with a close relationship with the shaman enter specifically in the category of tutelary spirits. And such tutelary spirits can take a variety of forms and can shapeshift and don't have to necessarily have a specific gender. But then there is another reason why we don't see a lot of spirit husbands and why we see a lot more female tutelary spirits. Not wives, but specifically female tutelary spirits. So let's explore that as well. So we have another reason why we don't see a lot of this conception of spirit husband, and indeed not of a spirit wife for that matter, as wife and husband, the terms being specifically a spouse. But we find a lot more about female tutelary spirits. Now, of course, we could argue that the great majority of shamanic communities have male shamans rather than female shamans. Female shamans are fewer in number when compared to the great amount of communities with male shamans. It's also true that a lot of shamanic communities have a great tendency to be patriarchal in nature. Therefore, the religious position, the position of the spiritual leader, is held by a male figure rather than female. Although this idea of the shaman having to strictly be a male figure isn't something fixed. It's not like that all the time. It's true that many shamanic communities have a male figure as their spiritual leader, precisely because of the influence of patriarchal societies. And this influence goes far back in history. as the great majority of ancient civilizations were a lot more patriarchal in their system of governance, especially when it comes to ancient societies of the Mediterranean, Near East, Northern Africa, and Asia Minor, as having been societies in which magic and religion walked hand in hand, and as such, magical performances were controlled by the state, and the state was patriarchal in great part. And in some civilizations, such as Greek, Hellenic, and Roman and Jewish, they were fully patriarchal. So yes, patriarchal influence upon shamanic communities led people to be more inclined to have a male spiritual leader. And that would explain the female tutelary spirits. But would it? Shamanism is a branch from animism, and animism was never patriarchal to begin with. So these patriarchal influences upon shamanism, especially Northern American, Eurasian, and African various shamanic cultures, is something that has been progressively happening, at least since the late Chalcolithic, when there is a considerable development of patriarchal systems in Eurasia, and in some cases, such as African and American, post-colonial religious influences upon the native spiritualities. As I've said, and as we shall see further ahead, where I shall explain this with more detail, the fact that there are far more evidences about female tutelary spirits rather than male spirit husbands isn't because there are more male shamans and therefore the gender restrictions mainly in evidence in Abrahamic religious beliefs that force the male figure to only have a companion of the opposite gender. As I said, gender fluidity is one of the main aspects of the shaman. And it wasn't and isn't unheard of the shaman acting and performing as a person with both genders, switching between genders according to the necessary spiritual work, from the simplest thing of cross-dressing all the way to sexual intercourse with the same gender, as it is still noticeable nowadays in living native cultures, and in the past as well in archaeology, with archaeology. I always like to give one specific case, one I had the pleasure to work at as an archaeologist, on a dig site of the Mesolithic, where the shaman of the community was found, no more than 30 years of age, considered quite old and wise for that time, and the spiritual leader was male, a man, and yet all his dressing code, all the jewelry, everything in the material culture surrounding the male spiritual leader was for the feminine gender. So this isn't a thing new of our societies. And please, good gods, save me. Spare me your comments saying that I'm on a political agenda, that I am a liberal, lefty, righty, a universalist, a traditionalist, homosexual, straight, troll, demon, and Satan. If the historical truth is too much to handle, please get yourself a lollipop and go cry somewhere else. Now, where was I? Yes. The fact that we find more female tutelary spirits specifically is precisely because shamanism is a branch of animism. There is no shamanism without an animistic worldview. As such, there are a lot more female tutelary spirits because of the animistic beliefs within shamanism. Let me explain. Among many shamanic communities, especially Eurasian ones, as two specific examples, the Buryat and the Teliut, after the completion of the initiation process to become a shaman, the shaman undergoes a spiritual journey to get to know the spiritual world, and this often also involves the communication with fertility spirits of the earth, of the land specifically, in order for the shaman to be aware of such entities when in the future, when it comes to future shamanic performances, to heal the land, to propitiate fertility by invoking and coming in contact with such fertility entities, some of which divinities. And in animistic societies, fertility spiritual entities of the earth specifically are almost always seen as female, due to the practically universal conception that the earth is the originator of life. It is the great Mother Earth figure, propitiator of fertility and plenty, and giving origins to life, and nurturing and sustaining that life. The shaman enters in a sexual relation with the fertility female spirits to obtain from them knowledge and spiritual power related to the life-giving powers of fertility. Sex doesn't mean that the shaman automatically gets married with these spiritual entities. The point here is transferring spiritual energy, power, and knowledge, and for that the shaman needs to interact with the spirits, having all sorts of relationships with the spirits. Among the Buryat, it is precisely when the initiation process comes to an end that the shaman meets his or her future celestial wife or husband, and with her or him to his spirit or has sexual relations. This celestial wife is the tutelary spirit of the shaman in Buryat shamanic beliefs. There is an intimate relationship between the shaman and this celestial spirit, forming a permanent alliance which the shaman will need throughout its entire life. Among the Talyut, this happens too. The shaman has a celestial wife, for lack of better term. But it is a tutelary spirit, a spirit guide with a strong relationship with the shaman, and there is a strong link, almost unbreakable, when compared with the other helping spirits the shaman too will encounter throughout its life. But such spirits will not be attached or have such a specific relationship as this specific celestial wife. But it isn't just this celestial wife that will attend the shaman. The shaman is also assisted in its labors by feminine spirits. It's actually curious because within at least Eurasian shamanism, there is this frequent idea that when the shaman dies, the feminine assistant spirits come to earth to take his spirit. And furthermore, the shaman having its celestial wife inviting him to eat with her. Does this remind you of something? Yes, of course. The Valkyriur, the Valkyries in Valhalla in Norse myths and other mythologies, actually, Slavic mythology as well. This well-known mythical theme of the meal that the feminine spirits of the other world offer to every mortal when such mortal people die and reach their domains, in order that the mortal person may forget the earthly life and remain forever in their power. In many folk beliefs, there is always either a goddess, demigoddess, or feminine spiritual entities offering food and taking people away into the other world. But this idea of the shaman having a celestial wife and this wife brings him food and has sexual intercourse with the shaman shows us the general belief that the shaman is seen as a cultural hero, even a semi-divine figure, since the shaman has experienced death and resurrection and therefore enjoys a second life in the other world among various spirits, including divine ones. I'm not going to enter in further discussion of this mythical motif of the celestial wife, the earth mother, the female assistant spirits, but indeed it preserves a lot of traces from an earlier matriarchal mythology and animistic worldviews of the very earth having been perceived as a mother figure, as in giving origins to life, nurturing that life and providing the necessary conditions and resources so life may continue to exist. In this panorama of taking care of its creations with love and affection, like a mother. But specifically returning to the female tutelary spirits of the shaman, we see this in a wondrous variety of shamanic cultures. Feminine assistant spirits, which help the shaman both in his or her instructions and in his ecstatic experiences, attend the shaman on the necessary preparations to the shamanic journey, so the shamanic journey may take place and be successful in the attempt. So it seems natural to have this perception that the feminine tutelary spirits intervene in the shaman's mystical experience through sexual emotion, as the ecstatic experience in itself is already a transition between the physical and the spiritual. The close relations between mystical and carnal love and sexual deviation as a process that helps to induce this transition, this union between the mortal condition of the shaman and the spiritual reality in which the shaman must be inserted in. I'm not a bleeding poet, so it's hard to explain the mechanics of something that can hardly be understood outside the scope of shamanism. Of course, especially in modern societies so detached from such spiritual understandings. There are a lot of erotic elements present in shamanic rites that totally exceed the regular physical sexual interaction we mere mortals have in our daily lives. So it's something a lot more transcendental. Just as sex is when, of course, when we reach climax, and for a moment there's just something more, and indeed beyond our usual perception of reality, and there's a bit of a transcendental process in there. There's a lot of obscene performances from the part of the shaman, and even considered amoral acts by our modern societies, but with sexual connotations precisely to arouse sexuality among the community, to propitiate fertility. Ritualized sexual performances to ensure the flowing of sexual desire, so the community may grow. The sexual performances of the shaman, in great part, have a cosmological function. It is the cosmological reenactment of the renewal of the world and life, just as the same way as the ritualized orgy. It is the recreation within the community of the cosmological mythical chaos before creation. The orgy is a ritual reenactment of the primordial chaos and makes it possible for creation to be repeated, and through the ritualized orgy, this entire theme is recreated within the human community. The point here is that the shaman is harnessing these powers through ritual and ceremony and sacrifice, and expressing such powers and transforming them and transporting to the human community. So in this way, I think we can better grasp the importance and the meaning behind the sexual relation the shaman has with its female tutelary spirits. These are part of a considerable number of rituals intended to increase the sexual vigor of the community. These tutelary feminine spirits are often providers of something, and in great part also give to the shamans the helping spirits that are in some way indispensable to them, to the shamans, in their ecstatic journeys, as a sort of feminine mother figures in some way holding other spiritual entities and giving them to the shaman in specific occasions at specific labors. And this actually resembles the great mother of the animals seen in many ancient societies and, of course, many shamanic cultures as well, as precisely the great mother of animals, which in religious societies evolved to the goddess of the hunt, the great mother of animals with which the shaman has a great and special relationship with, this spiritual divinity that grants mankind, and particularly grants to the shaman, the right to hunt and to sustain themselves on the flesh of animals. The Great Mother figure providing sustainability by sending forth the spirits of animals under her protection and care, so mankind might hunt, if she so allows it, and have a means of survival. But this Great Mother of animals is especially notable in Arctic shamanism, where agriculture is extremely difficult and even impossible in some regions, and the hunt is the only means of survival. But it gives us indications of the cult of the Great Mother of animals in archaic matriarchal systems which spread all over the place. Take Artemis of the Hellenic cultural world, for instance. But let's not drift away from the main subject. So, as we have seen, the tutelary spirit and the shaman build a lifelong relationship. This doesn't have to necessarily be a sort of marriage and the tutelary spirit becoming a spirit husband or spirit wife. But perhaps this conception of a spirit spouse is from the perspective of Western civilizations towards shamanic cultures, equating the intense and strong relationship the shaman has with its tutelary spirit with a conception much more familiar to the Western society, which is marriage. It may have never been seen as an actual marriage by native peoples. This happens a lot even nowadays, but especially in the 19th century and early 20th century anthropological and ethnological studies, trying to understand native spiritualities by making a connection with concepts more familiar to the people who studied these native traditions. But such concepts not actually familiar to the native peoples themselves, which then, of course, creates a lot of wrong assumptions and wrong views, which just push us further away from actually understanding such cultural panoramas. Anyway, there's no doubt that the shaman has a close relationship with its tutelary spirit, and one of the most powerful means of expressing this closeness is through sexuality. Sexual intercourse with spirits isn't strictly reserved to the tutelary spirit, but the shaman may also indeed experience sexual encounters with a spirit that doesn't have to necessarily be its tutelary spirit. But concerning the tutelary spirit, and in most Asian shamanic cultures, it is precisely the moment the tutelary spirit appears to the person for the first time that it will be revealed to the person by the tutelary spirit that the person is to become a shaman. The tutelary spirit makes the announcement and attaches itself to the soon-to-be shaman through sexual intercourse, thus forming a union. And from that moment onwards, the tutelary spirit becomes not only the assistant and guardian of the shaman, but also a provider, providing the shaman with helping spirits so the shaman may perform its labors concerning shamanic session. The primary job of the shaman is to heal. So these helping spirits provided by the tutelary spirit will aid the shaman in healing performances. The tutelary spirit becomes a teacher, a helper, the main assistant spiritual entity of the shaman. Through sexual intercourse, both the tutelary spirit and the shaman are connected. From the moment the tutelary spirit attaches itself to the shaman must obey it or die. That's something important to reflect on, because the westernization of shamanism gives us the impression that the shaman is in total control and that the feminine tutelary spirits are his servants. But it isn't so. From the moment the sexual act was performed, the shaman is attached to the feminine tutelary spirits. There's no way around it. And the shaman must obey. The tutelary spirit is a teacher and a guide, and it is there to make sure the shaman learns and succeeds, because it's no joke. Lives are at stake. It's not banging the drum once or twice and go on Facebook and join a group about shamanism, et voila, you are a shaman. Congratulations. No, this is serious, and the shaman must obey and learn. And as the shaman develops its skills, the tutelary spirit will progressively be more quiet and gain a lot more confidence in the abilities and the skills of the shaman, and won't intervene that much because the shaman gained a considerable amount of knowledge and power and skill. But until such time, the shaman must obey. This also has parallels with the male and female shamans of the Sahara people in India. In this particular case, in this particular cultural background, we also see this conception of spirit spouse. And in here, there are female shamans who accept spirit husbands. Actually, it's not a question of acceptance. It's the male tutelary spirit that kidnaps the spirit of the girl who is to become a shaman, carries her into the other world, and the girl's refusal to become a shaman leads her to fall into a deep sickness of the body and of the mind, and it is terrible, until the community arranges the marriage between her and her forced tutelary spirit. So both in male and female soon-to-be shamans, in a great many shamanic cultural backgrounds, the tutelary spirit forces itself upon the person it chose to be a future shaman, and continues to insist. There's sexual intercourse as a means for the spirit to bind itself to the future shaman. And I can't help to think that this has close parallels with, precisely, the incubus and the succubus again, which I really don't want to go down that road on this video, not today anyway, but it's pretty interesting because, as said before, incubi and succubi are specific demons, spirits, that go through a great length and really insist a lot until they have sexual intercourse with the person they have chosen, and they want to satiate their sexual appetites. That's their main objective. They do not wish to harm the person. However, harm comes to the person not because the incubi or succubi purposely caused harm, but harm results either from the corruption that follows the sexual intercourse, leading to physical illness of the host, that is, the human being, or harm comes from the refusal of the host to gratify the demon's lust, in which case it becomes violent towards the person. This also happens precisely with tutelary spirits. And just as the example I have given you of the Sahara people in India, by the sexual intercourse with the soon-to-be tutelary spirit, or by the refusal to do so, either way, the soon-to-be shaman enters in a deep sickness from which it will only find cure by accepting the tutelary spirit and accepting the new life, the life of a shaman. This illness provoked by the tutelary spirit through sexual intercourse is attested in many shamanic cultures, and through a series of rituals and ceremonies and also sacrifices, either by the community or by the shaman itself, an official marriage of sorts, an official binding is created, and the shaman no longer suffers the sickness provoked by the tutelary spirit, because they are both officially attached for life. For more information on the incubus and the succubus subjects, perhaps you ought to read Du Dissimulalitate Incubi et Succubi. Doesn't matter. I'll put it in here on the screen. But it's important to take special notice that the relationship between the tutelary spirit and the shaman is not primarily a sexual one. The important thing expressed here is that the tutelary spirit should inspire and instruct its young shaman in dreams. Now, speaking of gender identity, it's not unheard of the gender fluidity within shamanism. I've given you that one example before where I've been on a dig site of a male shaman of the Mesolithic dressed as a woman. Relations with tutelary spirits in shamanism might also entail gender transformations. I'm going to pick the Chuchi people as one example, so we won't have to go about the hundreds of thousands of different cases. The Chuchi shamans were occasionally compelled by their tutelary spirits to change gender and live out their lives in a reversed gender condition. The transformation of men into transgender women was far more common than the transformation of women into transgendered men. But both panoramas were known and accepted among the Chuchi people since primordial times and as far as the 20th century, actually. Things are somewhat a little bit different nowadays for everybody, as many native societies are progressively disappearing and losing ground. But such transgender individuals usually went through their change of gender at the time of the first shamanic culling, at the insistence of the tutelary spirits with whom they had formed an intensive and close relationship. The shaman, be that male or female, would go through gender transformation for its tutelary spirit. But this did not stop the shaman from having a husband or wife or both in the physical world. In fact, the gender fluidity of the shaman permitted him or her to also have both genders as earthly husbands or wives. It's in these cases of gender fluidity from the part of the shaman that we also often see the spirit husband, tutelary spirit, in the transformation process of the shaman from male gender to female gender, and the tutelary spirit being male, or the transformation of the feminine shaman into transgendered man and having a feminine tutelary spirit. But also, as it so happens, there are plenty of male shamans becoming women and the tutelary spirit being feminine, and shaman women going through the transformation process to become man, and the tutelary spirits are male, which builds a close relationship between the shaman and its tutelary spirits, as both having the same gender. Although this gender identity conception in shamanism is something not that much explored because such anthropological and ethnological studies have often been conducted by people either of Western societies or people influenced by religious, philosophical, Western thinking that completely disagrees and indeed even finds abnormal this gender fluidity. So this is a subject that has been in the shadows many times, unfortunately and sadly. It's impressive the amount of knowledge that we simply are not aware of its existence because our societies disagree with. And as such, it simply evaporates as if it never existed. Now, indigenous people throughout North America have occasionally identified explicit roles and statuses for community members, which avoid the binary oppositions that had become normative in Western notions of sexuality. Third and fourth gender or two-spirit identities sometimes existed in communities where they were not only accepted but greatly respected as well. Perhaps because the native Northern American societies In there is a strong underlying principle that individuals who occupy an intermediate or ambivalent position are spiritually powerful, or simply because they are more humane and have a life's philosophy far more civilized than the perceptions of the civilized cultures that were imposed on them in the colonial process. The ability to cross or transcend gender boundaries could indeed render such people as particularly effective as shamans, giving the shaman's general role of mediating different worlds and social spaces and being the mediators between the physical and the spiritual realities. So the ability or the gender fluidity aspect of the shaman makes it easier for the shaman itself to cross boundaries of every kind, especially social boundaries. As such, in a number of North American shamanic traditions, shamans who had undergone temporary or permanent gender transformation were known and highly respected. Of course, not all transgender persons in these societies became shamans, obviously, and likewise, not every shaman expressed transgender behavior, but it was a completely normal and accepted reality. In this way, perhaps the shamanic gender transformation should be understood as a distinct category of spiritual experience related particularly to the relation of a shaman and a tutelary spirit. And perhaps this is why there were strong distinctions of sorcery behavior and shamanic techniques among the old Norse people, and the transgender quality of the male practitioner of Seidr gave him, or in this case her, a different position in Norse society and were often labeled Ergi. And it is of my belief that both Ergi and Trollskapr were actually magical performances practiced by transgender individuals that progressively turned into insults with the advent of Christianity. But more on that on the video I have done precisely about homosexuality in the Viking Age, which I'll leave a link to that video on the description of this one. And in that video you have in the end the bibliography I have used, so you can explore more on this subject. But it's curious, another example from the top of my head that I have read about it, of course, the Mapuche shamans, the Machi, to be more specific as the term for the Mapuche shamans. In ritual activities they often alternate gender identities as they embody the four main figures, which is the old man, old woman, the young man, and the young woman, who together constitute the chief deity, Nunechan, one of the most important spiritual beings within the traditional religion and beliefs of the Mapuche people. The gender fluidity on the part of the shaman is also as a means to better communicate with and indeed create a strong connection with specific spiritual entities within the panorama of divinity. Precisely the transformative process into the gender of the deity the shaman needs to work with or is attached to learn and harness the spiritual power to better help the community. Now, when we speak of shamanism, we naturally often think about Siberia, obviously, as the term shamanism and shaman derives from the Tunguska people, as I have probably, I hope, pointed out in a note in the beginning of this video. In various Siberian shamanic cultures, we find clear evidences of this gender fluidity as well as gender and sexual identity, of what among these people they describe as having in their communities third or neutral sex individuals, in particular connection with shamanism. It is part of the process of becoming a shaman, this recreation of the self, and the individual often crosses the normally acceptable gender boundaries of his or her society, frequently expressed by taking on the dress and the lifestyle of the opposite sex in that same society. Either temporary or permanently, as was pointed out before, and with a variety of impacts on the sexual orientation of the shaman. If you remember my recent video about Loki, the Norse deity, which I shall also place on the description of this video, you probably remember that Loki has its origins possibly in the figure of the shaman precisely, as the cultural hero, the figure that crosses boundaries, amoral, both revered and feared. And Loki, just like the shaman, not only has the shape-shifting aspect about him, but also the transformative aspect as being a character who is able to change gender at will. Odin himself is often considered to be Ergi and Hargr, and is even accused of such by Loki himself in Lokasena as also being a male god related to magical practices and sorcerous acts, Seidr to be more precise, and as such playing the role of women in such magical arts, being Ergi and Argr. But on that, I advise you to again explore that other video I have done on homosexuality in the Viking Age and take a look at the bibliography I pointed out in that video. Anyway, of all that was said here concerning gender and sexual identity, there are obvious parallels between all these gender identities and the complexity of sexual relations surrounding the Norse society and social moral in the Viking period, along with the Ergi-related practices and the men who took on such labels or associated with such practices. Speaking of Old Norse, to finalize this video, as said before, indeed in Old Norse literature we find something similar to the concept of spirit spouse or female tutelary spirit, to be more precise. There are at least 4 videos I would like you to watch, aside from the ones I have previously recommended, and I'll put them down below in the description so you can explore even more of this and what shall be said. Now, the concept of the Norse fetch is the only perception of a spiritual entity that can come closer to the concept of spirit spouse. This fetch is often referred to as Fylgja, plural Fylgjur. Please do watch my video about it in here, if you can, the Animal Fylgja, where I explore this subject in more detail. In fact, the Fylgja is closely associated with a familiar spirit, an animal guide, almost even a conception closer to animal totem in some sources, but not quite. The Fylgja is a soul-like entity of the individual that can be separated from the physical body, a spectrum of sorts that follows a person throughout that person's entire life, from birth till death. Let's say that it is a dimension of the self that can be attached to the person just like a familiar spirit, a guardian spirit, or a tutelary spirit, but can also be separated and sent forth on an errand and is able to have a life of its own. It is often understood that whatever happens to the person, including death, it will also happen to the person's own Fylgja. But in the great majority of sources, actually, if harm is caused to the Fylgja, the person will also suffer harm. But if by any chance the person dies for some reason, the Fylgja doesn't necessarily die because it's already a spiritual entity, a dimension of the self, an everlasting dimension of the self. So what happens upon a person's death is that the Fylgja moves on with its own life or can attach itself to another person, often a younger person belonging to the family of the Fylgja's previous owner, a descendant, and often skip generations. For instance, when a person dies, its Fylgja moves on and won't necessarily attach itself to the son of that person, but later on in life it will come to be attached to the grandchild, according to the sources. This is particularly interesting because in shamanism, the tutelary spirit is often of an ancestral shaman belonging to that family line and won't be necessarily attached to the person of the next generation, but will wait and skip generations and choose the soon-to-be shaman a generation ahead or a few generations ahead. Although the Fylgja of a person is often perceived as taking the shape of an animal, usually the animal whose attributes and personality match the person's own. We see some parallels here with animal totem conceptions. In several Old Norse sources, we have a couple of examples of this conception of an animal form connected with the individual, and this entity is only perceptible in dreams or can be seen by those who have the power of second sight, which gives them the ability to see the fylgjur of others in the waking world. For instance, in the Fletteria book, there is a child named Thorstein that one day came into a hole he was used to go, but on that specific day, as he entered the hole running, the child slipped on the floor and fell. Geirtir, a man with the power of second sight, burst out laughing when he saw the child fall, and Thorstein, the child, asked Geirtir why he was laughing, and Geirtir told the boy that as he entered the hole, he saw a white bear cub following the boy. When the animal was aware that Geirtir could see it, it was surprised and stopped, and so the child fell over the animal, the boy's own Fylgja. Geirtir noticed the white bear cub was the boy's Fylgja and concluded that Thorstein might not be the son of his parents, but of someone else with a greater lineage, as the bear is a symbol, as you know it, of high birth in many ancient European religious symbolisms. The animal in prehistoric Europe perceived to be the chieftain or even the king of the forests, therefore connecting the animal, the bear, with royalty and nobility in general. The case of the myth of Arthur, for instance, is his own name, meaning bear. But it doesn't matter now. In Nordic pre-Christian belief systems, religious conceptions, and within folklore, an individual or individuals are only aware of their own Fylgja or of the Fylgjur of others in dreams, unless they possess, of course, the second sight. But in the great majority of cases, the awareness of the Fylgja is when the human is unconscious, and so the Fylgja is active. While unconscious, people had the perception of what was to come based on the appearance and form of the Fylgja, which was intimately tied to their owners. So they expressed fate. And this is when we enter in the concept of the Hamingja, as well as parallels with the helping spirits of a shaman that can only be perceived in dreams while unconscious, just like the tutelary spirits specifically. Please watch my video about the concept of the Hamingja, and again I shall put it down below in the description of this video, since YouTube only allows me to recommend 5 videos on this right upper corner. From the Old Norse sources, it's clear that the Fylgja is an entity which is part of the spirit of a person, a detached entity, or better still, a dimension of the self, something which precedes an individual to announce that person's coming and to tell those who have the power to see it, see the Fylgja, what kind of person it is, what sort of personality it has, and the intentions of that person. In this way, the Fylgja is also the projection of the will residing in the conscious. So in shamanic perceptions, it is actually closer to the very mind of the shaman being sent forth on an errand, which the Old Norse people somewhat equated that with the so-called Gandir. Gandir, the plural form. Of all the many meanings behind the Gandir, from general spirit to magic and sorcery or staff or wand, the Gandir is also perceived as the very spirit, a Fylgja-like spirit that can be sent forth from a gondul, which is a staff or a wand, a type of utensil used to send forth the Gandir, send forth the spirit to perform something on an errand on the behalf of the sorcerer. This also has close parallels with shamanism and the use of utensils, mostly staffs and wands, to attract and hold the helping spirits in it, precisely. Also, the Fylgja also seems to act on behalf of its owner while the person is unconscious, to carry out various errands for the person, as we perceive in Seidr, sending forth the mind in the form of one's own Fylgja. And this is the only time the concept of the Fylgja enters in something similar to a shamanic performance in ancient Scandinavia, as an helping spirit specifically. Seidr is not fully shamanism per se, but contains certain aspects that can be found in shamanism. I'm sorry, I'll have to recommend yet another video precisely on the helping spirits in Seidr, and you will certainly better understand this entire concept in relation to the Gandar and other helping spirits in Seidr, precisely, specifically. In Seidr, the conception of the Fylgja enters as the projection of the mind of the vulva. A vulva, or a Seitkona, was a seeress, a prophetess. So with this being said, the Fylgja only reflects certain shamanic understandings, indeed, that survived in the written sources, composed in a time when all of this shamanic panorama had already been put aside or seen as abnormal. So all these concepts are very confusing indeed, but we still find parallels with shamanic performances. Now, the Fylgja reflects the vestiges of what was once something that truly belonged in a shamanic understanding, but was almost utterly forgotten and became an entity surviving practically only in folklore, in great part. But as previously said, the Fylgja is indeed related to the concept of the Hamingja, and it is here that we might find parallels between the Fylgja and the spirit spouse in relation to the gender transformation shape-shifting aspect of this spiritual entity. I also have a video about this, precisely about the Hamingja as a guardian spirit specifically, down below in the description. Please check it. But as previously said, the Fylgja, in the Old Norse beliefs, is regarded as a guardian animal of a person, the closest thing we have to an animal totem / familiar spirit / helping spirit, and not necessarily a tutelary spirit with human form. I remind you that not all tutelary spirits, of course, necessarily have human form, but concerning the spirit spouse, usually they have human form, and that's what we are trying to focus on. The Fylgja often appears in animal form, there's no dispute. But then, in some Old Norse sources, we start to have another conception for the Fylgja, that of a guardian spirit, specifically in the form of a woman, which is called Fylgjakonna, precisely woman Fylgja. For instance, in Helfredar saga, Helfredar is on his ship and finds a woman ahead, clad in a coat of mail, walking over the waves. Immediately, Helfredar knew she was his Fylgjakonna, his woman Fylgja, his guardian and protective spirit. The woman was meant to be the guardian of another person, but that person refused her, and so Helfredar accepted her as his Fylgja. In this particular account, unlike the animal Fylgja who dies if the owner dies or moves on upon the owner's death, and only the gods know where it goes, the Fylgja woman lives on after the death of the man whom she has attended, and then she must pass on to someone else, just like the regular Fylgja in some accounts. But it's with the woman Fylgja that we find this great attachment to a person. The Fylgja woman plays the role of the tutelary spirit, and she skips generations until it is attached to a person. But one of the big differences is that the Fylgja as an animal spirit is attached to a person since birth, while the Fylgja as a woman is a guardian that appears in a person's life at a certain point after she stops being the guardian spirit of another who died and therefore no longer needs guardianship. The Fylgjokona, the Fylgja woman, is the only concept in Old Norse literature and belief system that we find closer to this conception of the spirit spouse. The Fylgja is intimately tied with the fate of a person and the luck of that person, with the Hamingja, which is specifically luck as a spiritual force. There is a clear relation between both the Fylgja and the Hamingja, because the moment the Fylgja attaches itself to a person, it becomes part of that person and part of that person's fate. So, the very nature of the Fylgja develops alongside with the nature of the person to whom it belongs. There is a deep connection, a binding, even a binding spiritual life. In most accounts, the Fylgja is indeed related to the Hamingja of the person, to the luck of the person, in a sense of fate, the person's fate. We seem to have an understanding here that the Fylgja becoming a guardian spirit of a person is automatically attached to the fate of that person as well. They share fate, since, as we have seen, when the person dies, the Fylgja also dies. In some accounts, of course. When the Fylgja becomes a guardian entity, it assumes a different shape. Often in the sagas, this shape is presented as being the opposite gender of the person to whom the Fylgja belongs to. The Fylgja sometimes comes indeed in the form of a person, which can be of the opposite gender precisely. And in the sources, many times it is linked, when it has the shape of a person, it is linked to future events, to warn people of what's to come, and in relation to divination and such. In the various sources I've expressed in the videos I've suggested earlier, when the Fylgja assumes the shape of a human and being the opposite gender of the person it belongs to, it is often in the sense of being a protective spirit of the person, a guardian spirit, familiar spirit, a tutelary spirit, coming to warn a person of danger or the inevitability of fate. So in conclusion, the Fylgja being attached to the fate of a person becomes a guardian entity which assumes the shape of the opposite gender of the person to whom the Fylgja belongs to, but only in the scenarios related to fate in Old Norse literature, be that divination or in the sense of revealing what's to come, or to warn the person of danger. The Fylgja only assumes human shape in such cases, always connected to guardianship. So in a way, it has some parallels, indeed, with the concept of the spirit spouse in shamanism as a tutelary spirit. And it's quite possible that the Fylgja originally was something similar to the spirit spouse, since both the spirit spouse and the Fylgja play the role of guardianship sometimes. But the Fylgja seems to be closer to an animal spirit, a fetch, a familiar spirit, an animal totem, which in shamanism is also perceived as being a spiritual entity of guidance and protection to a certain extent. And this enters in the category of helping spirits in general. The tutelary spirit is also a helping spirit, but it has a closer and intimate relationship with the shaman, and it often assumes human form and presents a fluidity in gender transformation to which the shaman sometimes is obliged to follow, and the shaman too must adapt to this gender fluidity and act accordingly. So the Fylgjokona, the woman Fylgja, is the only Old Norse concept closer to the spirit spouse as a tutelary spirit in human form, when the Fylgja becomes attached to the fate of the person and becomes the Hamingja itself, the personified luck of a person. I've spoken about the Gandir as well, Gandir as the plural form, and those enter in the category of general helping spirits, as I have said, assistant spirits in animal form, just like the Fylgja, usually sent forth on an errand from the part of the sorcerer with the aid of a gondul, an utensil with a phallic shape. Could be a wand, could be a staff, which the Volur, the prophetesses, used precisely as staff, a distaff to be more precise, but I shall have to explore that some other time, don't worry. Also, there is the Voredur, Verdir as the plural form. These are definitely what we understand as tutelary spirits, often also playing the role of protective spirits, but when they are related to a human form in the sources, they are only related to the dead and not specifically women. Also, there's another point, just so we can finish this. We have the Disir in Old Norse belief system. The Disir are always female, partly deity and part spirit. There are references to festivals and festivities in general in their honor. Several of the Eddic poems, such as the Outlamol in Grønlandske, strongly imply that the Disir were the souls of dead women, serving similar functions to those of the Valkyriur, the Valkyries. So some parallels with the tutelary spirit of the shaman as his spirit spouse and assisting the shaman and giving him food in the other world, as we previously spoke. Now, the Disir could also be female ancestors of a family, almost identical to the Fylgjur in that aspect. But there are also the Landadisir, specific spirits of the land, female in nature. The Disir seem to be the sort of group of spiritual entities in general, feminine spirits that had a great importance in Old Norse belief system and part of the rituals and ceremonies and sacrifices in the daily lives of Old Norse ordinary people, demonstrating that the core of Old Norse belief system still held a considerable amount of animistic world views, and the Disir are also demonstrate a more matriarchal conception of the spiritual life. The Disir are specifically feminine, but we can hardly say that they indeed played a role as spirit spouses. But the fact that the term Disir may refer to every kind of feminine supernatural entity, including goddesses, perhaps the Fylgjokona enters in the category of Disir, since it is a Fylgja woman specifically. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it was useful. Lots to say, quite the long video, I know. And please go down below into the description of this video and check the videos I have recommended. That will give you a lot more information about many of the concepts here expressed. If you have come this far, congratulations. Make a drinking game every time I say the terms shaman or shamanism. and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, subscribe, and share the video all over the place. Thank you in advance. And once again, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag.